So we'll get started with today's webinar. Welcome to the webinar, Crop Advisors Perspectives on Pesticide Resistance Management. My name is Laura Isles. I'm one of the co-directors of the North Central IPM Center. There's 4 regional IPM centers supported by USDA NIFA Crop Protection and Pest Management Program. All the centers have a mission to coordinate IPM across the country and across our region, of course, by sharing and promoting IPM research, and we're excited to do that today. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A portion at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to type in questions at any time, but we'll wait until the end of the presentation to do it. So today we're excited to welcome Katie Dentzman from Iowa State University. And I will let you take it away, Katie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to be talking about a project called Certified Crop Advisors Perspectives on Pesticide Resistance, which was funded by a Critical Issues grant from the North Central IPM Center. So very grateful to them for those funding. So I'm a rural sociologist, and I've been working on issues of pesticide resistance for a pretty long time now. Since my dissertation started about 10 years ago. And a lot of that really focused on the human sides, because I'm a sociologist, right? I deal with kind of these human dimensions and human issues of why are people doing what they're doing? And why do they sometimes change their behaviors or their practices? And how can we facilitate that and support people in the ways that they need? So my work started pretty much with growers, but has kind of evolved into looking at who supports growers as well. So for a little bit of context, my past research really focused in on corn and soybean farmers and found that they are limited in their integrated pest management adoption in a few different ways. Because people would say, oh, why aren't people just using IPM? What's going on there? And really what I was finding was that there were a lot of barriers people were confronting to actually using IPM. So one of those things was individualism. So IPM, obviously, herbicide resistance, insecticide resistance, all of these things aren't just a single field or single farm issue. They're very mobile. And so you really have to be able to manage it as a community, because if your neighbor's not managing it very well, it's really going to affect how you're managing it. But when I was talking to these growers, they were saying, there's no way I could discuss this with my neighbor. I can't tell them how to farm. So it was really tough to kind of get over that barrier of individualism to get people coordinating together. People also tended to have kind of this sense of techno-optimism or almost fatalism, where they thought that they would need a new pesticide, a new herbicide, that new silver bullet, right? And that was what was going to maybe solve things. But a lot of that was also driven by kind of this idea that nothing else would work. So it's almost fatalistic. We have to have this new chemistry, or else we're just not going to be able to be in farming anymore. They also mentioned farm size and labor availability as a reason that they struggled to adopt IPM. The visibility and intensity of the pest was another thing that really showed up. So if we were talking to people, say in Georgia, where they had really severe Palmer amaranth infestations, they were probably a lot more willing to talk about IPM than folks who didn't have as big of an infestation. And then one of the other things that we saw was really, where are people getting their information on pesticides, on pesticide resistance, and on integrated pest management? And this started to come up again and again of who do they trust? Who are they talking to? Where are they getting this information? And kind of what's the social network that's surrounding these growers who are making these kinds of decisions? So increasingly, my research is kind of focused in on this sources of information aspect to really paint a better picture of who has an influence on the decisions that growers are making on the ground, and how are those different sources of information trusted? How are they developed? So this project really focuses in on that. And so for this, I wanted to look at crop advisors in particular. And so agronomists came up as really this key group when I was talking to a lot of the growers of, well, I talked to my crop advisor, I talked to my agronomist, and they tell me what they think I should be doing. So I wanted to find out more about how crop advisors specifically are thinking about and dealing with pesticide resistance and how they're advising their customers. So I work together with the Center for Survey Statistics and Methodology, Survey Research Services at Iowa State University, and got a sample from the Agronomy Society of America. And so basically they maintain a list of all of the US-based certified crop advisors. And so they allowed us to access that list in order to send these folks a survey. So we randomly selected 2,000 of these people to send a survey that was sent in December of 2022. And we got 367 back, which is about a 20% response rate, which is actually quite good for survey research in the modern day. So felt pretty good about that. And there are a couple of research questions that we really analyzed. And one of them was just how concerned are crop advisors about resistance? Where are they on this scale and what influences that concern? What makes it hard to bring up resistance issues with their customers? What's the role of retailers and manufacturers in this? Because kind of from some focus groups, I got a sense that crop advisors and retailers maybe had some different roles. What do they think their customers are constrained by? What needs to change in order to have better pesticide resistance management? And what are the most effective options as we kind of go forward? So we had a variety of different folks who answered the survey, and most of those people tended to work with more than 3 crops. We had about 58% of people who answered our survey who worked with 3 to 5 crops, and most of those were corn, and then after that, potatoes, sugar beets, wine grapes, soybeans, and wheat. So a majority were working with corn growers. We also had a fairly large distribution of how many acres these crop advisors that we surveyed covered. A lot of them covered 10,000 or fewer, but we actually had around 10% who covered over 100,000 as well. So a good distribution there. And then as far as customers advised, again, a fairly good distribution where some were on the smaller scale side, some were on the larger scale side. Then we also looked at some of their demographics and kind of what groups of people were answering the survey and how they were maybe similar or different. And we looked at growers who were both associated with a certain corporation or company, so if they worked for Corteva or something, versus if they were independent. We looked at the amount of experience that they had in crop advising. We looked at the number of customers. We looked at their age, their gender, et cetera, and tried to see if there were any trends or related characteristics. So we did tend to see that people who were associated with a larger agrochemical company had more experience in crop advising and had a higher number of customers and acres managed. And this was in contrast to some of the more independent crop advisors who tended to have a higher level of education but fewer years of experience, and those people were more likely to be women as well. There weren't a ton of age differences going on there. But those were basically the people that we were talking to, right? And this was spread all across the US. We got respondents from all 50 states, and there was a fair breadth of the kinds of experience they had, the kind of education they had, whether they were associated with a corporation or if they were more independent, and kind of the acreage that they covered as well. So if you wouldn't mind putting up the poll that I developed. So I have a little poll for you guys to answer. And one of the first questions we asked was, what are you most concerned about as far as resistance? And so I wanted to ask you all if you thought that crop advisors were going to be more concerned about herbicide resistance, insecticide resistance, or fungicide resistance. So take a quick moment to go ahead and vote in the poll. We asked our respondents, which of these are you very concerned? Are you moderately concerned? Are you slightly concerned? Okay. Maybe somebody can help me out with this. How do I see the results? Oh, there we go. Awesome. So we had 71% of you who said probably herbicide resistance. About 14% said insecticide and 14% said fungicide. And that's pretty much how it played out. So definitely the crop advisors that we talked to are most concerned about herbicide resistance. So basically the bars that you see here, the blue bar is, nah, we're not really concerned. So for herbicide resistance, about 25% of respondents said they weren't really that concerned about it. And then about 35% said they were moderately concerned, and 40% said they were very concerned about herbicide resistance. Then for insecticides, it was about 55% said they were slightly or not at all concerned, about 30% said moderately, and only about 15% said they were very concerned. And for fungicides, that was even more apparent, where it was almost 65% said they were slightly or not at all concerned. There's definitely a lot more concern about herbicide resistance, kind of moderate for insecticides, and then fairly low for fungicides. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more and try and see, okay, what's influencing that concern? So we asked them about their concern helping farmers manage herbicide resistance in the next 5 years. And as I just showed you, there's a fairly high level of concern. We also looked at what kind of determined this concern. And so positive, this means that if the crop advisor reported this characteristic, they were much more likely to be more concerned. So basically, they reported higher concern with herbicide resistance if they were working with corn, rice, or beets. They also reported higher concern if they were resistance management certified. So if they had a resistance management specialization as part of being a certified crop advisor, they tended to be more concerned. They're also more concerned if they lived in the southern US, which makes sense with where we see patterns of resistance, and also if they were large scale, if they worked with more acres and more customers. They also tended to be more concerned if they were independent versus associated with an agrochemical company. As far as what made them less concerned about herbicide resistance, working with fruit and having alfalfa or soybeans as a secondary or tertiary crop. So we can see that where they were, the scale that they were at, what kind of crops they work with, all kind of impacted whether or not they were concerned about herbicide resistance. As far as insecticides, I already went through this. Again, most people kind of in that slightly concerned area, but not as many moderately or very concerned. Things that positively influenced, so things that made people more concerned about insecticide resistance included working with nuts, vegetables, or fruit, being resistance management certified, being larger scale, and being located in the west, the plains, or the south. Things that made them less concerned were working with corn, pulses, wheat, sorghum, and having more years experience in advising. Then as far as fungicides, again, people tended to have the lowest concern. Only about 8% were very concerned about fungicide resistance. They were more likely to be very concerned if they worked with nuts, vegetables, potatoes, beets, fruits, or wine grapes. If they were resistance management certified, again, so that seemed really influential a lot of the time. If they were larger scale and if they were in the west or the south, they were less concerned about fungicide resistance if they worked with wheat. So now we have an idea of kind of the resistance issues that people were concerned about. But we also wanted to know about, okay, how do they talk to their customers about this and what might make that more difficult? So one of the things they thought might make it more difficult is when their customers feel that management is too difficult. And only about 28% of our crop advisor respondents thought that that was an issue, but that was pretty much the strongest one that they identified. They also said that customers are tired of hearing about resistance management, and that they might have to sometimes recommend a competitor's product. So again, not a ton of people were super concerned. They didn't really think that bringing up pesticide resistance with their customers was extremely difficult. But when it was, it tended to be because customers thought that pesticide resistance management was going to be too hard. They're just tired of hearing about it. Or sometimes the advisors themselves were concerned they would have to recommend one of their competitors' products to deal with these resistance issues. A couple other reasons, and these had pretty low agreement. They thought that maybe it would be harder to make a sale, it could hurt the relationship with their customer, and then some other reasons that people just wrote in that we didn't ask about. The customer might think that it costs too much, the customer might be unaware or doubtful that pesticide resistance is even an issue, and there's just no simple answers. And so it can be a harder discussion to have sometimes in those ways. So before I did this survey, I did a series of focus groups. And one of the things that came up in the focus groups with crop advisors was the relationship between crop advisors, their customers, and then retailers and manufacturers. So we had a series of questions about retailers and manufacturers in here as well. And really, there was concern among crop advisors that sometimes retailers talked their customers out of following their recommendations for pesticide resistance management. We had 45% agree and 7% strongly agree. We also saw that they thought retailers were often making recommendations based on the availability of the chemistries they had, as opposed to maybe what might actually work best. So that was a big concern. They also said that manufacturers and sales reps were sometimes giving their customers different information on resistance than they gave to the crop advisors themselves. So we had one interviewee, for instance, who was a farmer, a grower, and a crop advisor, and they went to 2 sessions with the same sales rep in their 2 different roles and said they got very different messages. So that was an issue they were coming across. They also said this is a problem because if customers get information from a different source and it kind of disagrees with what they think is best for pesticide resistance management, it can be really hard to change their minds. And they thought that customers received different messages among their different kinds of advisors. So they thought there might be some misinformation out there, basically. And then we asked about some sources of information beyond just crop advisors as well. and basically asked crop advisors, well, where do you get your information on pesticide resistance? And where do you think your customers get their information? So for crop advisors, it was from their own experience. It was also from university extension, from their customers, and from commodity groups. Then they said, our customers, the producers, are getting their information from us, and then also from retailers, from other farmers, and from university extension. And I thought it was really interesting here that one of the things that overlapped was university extension. So that might be kind of this key player who is providing information both to crop advisors and to growers. We also asked about producer constraints. So essentially, we asked crop advisors, when you're talking to your customers, what do you think is constraining them from addressing pesticide resistance more effectively? The highest agreement they had on something was economics. They thought their customers were constrained by the price of trying to manage things in a more integrated way. And then management complexity, obviously integrated pest management can be more complex, so that was a concern. Supply constraints, what kinds of chemistry they actually have access to, if there's any new chemistries coming out, available technology, same kind of thing. Time constraints played into it as well. How much time do their customers have to deal with pesticide resistance? Then kind of medium agreement that one of the issues was that their customers were expecting a silver bullet and that this would kind of come through and save the day, and that it could be hard to get their customers to manage pesticide resistance when they had this perception that there was going to be kind of this miracle cure at some point. Okay, so one of the other lines of questioning we had was what's going to need to change? We have all these issues we've identified as far as potentially different sources of information, as far as customer constraints, reasons it might be hard to talk to them. What needs to change to better manage pesticide resistance? The number one thing that crop advisors agreed had to change was farmers' mindsets. So, how they think about managing their pesticides, and that maybe it's not going to be just this simple application process, but more of a systems approach. They also mentioned that customers didn't seem to understand how slow the process of pesticide discovery, development, and commercialization could be, and that there needed to be some education on that. And also that solution costs were driving customer decisions. So they needed to put less emphasis on the cost and maybe more on what was going to work long term, as opposed to this kind of short term cost analysis. So that was what they saw that they needed to change. But as far as most effective options to make those changes happening, number one, crop advisors said, well, farmers need to experience resistance firsthand. If they did that, they would absolutely change. And I think we've seen a lot of that as far as farmers changing in the South when they have issues with Palmer amaranth, for instance. I thought it was also really interesting that one of the most effective options for changing pesticide management and resistance issues that crop advisors saw was that crop advisors said, we need to develop more trusting relationships with our growers. That was really fascinating to me. They also said that it might help for farmers to see their neighbors experiencing and managing resistance issues, if they could develop more consistent messaging among agricultural stakeholders, if private companies could invest more in the discovery of new modes of action, and if there was wider stakeholder collaboration to manage as a community. So there's pretty high agreement on all of these things. Like 92% said it would be effective if farmers experienced resistance firsthand. 71% said it would be pretty effective if you had all of these different stakeholders coming together to manage pesticide resistance as a community, as opposed to more individually. So a few key takeaways that I had throughout this study. And one of those was about concern, crop advisors' concern about pesticide resistance. And we saw that really there was a lot of concern for different kinds of pesticide resistance. It was the highest for herbicide resistance and lowest for fungicide resistance, but it was definitely an issue crop advisors are aware of. I also thought it was really interesting that the resistance management specialty certification that some crop advisors had really significantly increased their concern across all types of resistance. So when crop advisors get this training, they tend to be more aware and more concerned about it. We also saw that crop advisors who were serving more customers and acres tended to be more concerned. Maybe there's more of their livelihood involved in that. And we also saw that concern was highly dependent on the kinds of crops that advisors worked with. So where I showed you, working with corn, for instance, really increases your concern about herbicide resistance. It seems to be very crop dependent and to some extent location dependent. As far as some key takeaways of what the barriers are to more effectively managing resistance, a lot of our crop advisors said that bringing pesticide resistance management up with their customers isn't super hard. It was maybe a little tougher for some issues in insecticides and some specific crops, but it wasn't something that they really struggled to do. They were able to bring this up. But they did see that sometimes retailer recommendations were conflicting. And especially this was a problem for insecticide resistance, but it was a problem kind of across the board. This is really concerning for independent crop advisors who said, my customers are getting too much conflicting information and it makes it difficult to have these conversations. We also saw that customers were constrained by economics, managing complexity and time, or at least that's what crop advisors perceived that they were constrained by. Needed changes included customer mindsets, the customer understanding of the speed of innovation, especially true for people who are working with corn, the costliness of management options, I went over that. And then some effective options for the future would be customers experiencing resistance or seeing somebody else do it, developing trusting relationships between advisors and customers, getting more consistent messaging, enacting some community management, and that's been especially effective in some places in the South. You can check out the Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program where that has been especially effective, which essentially is this idea that maybe you can't manage it alone, that growers are going to have to work with their crop advisors, who are going to have to work with the retailers and with extension and with all these different players that are in a community in order to manage things more effectively. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. I went through that fairly quickly, but I think that somebody just popped in the chat a couple of articles that I've published using this data. So if you are interested in some more depth, absolutely check those out. If you don't have access to them, you can always email me for a copy. I'm happy to share those as well. But I wanted to open things up to the Q&A.
Sure, thank you, Katie. And great to leave some time for questions. And please, everyone, type in those questions into the Q&A. So one of the questions I have is, who are some of the key players that can help improve that flow of information between the crop advisors and their customers?
Yeah, so improving the flow of information between crop advisors and customers, I thought it was really interesting to look at kind of where crop advisors said those sources overlapped. So number one, crop advisors said, well, I talk to my customers. And they said, well, my customers talk to me. Great. But who else is involved in this process? And one thing that really stood out was that university extension role. And that stood out to me because it popped up in this survey, but also because it's popped up in other surveys that I've done. So I did another national survey of corn and soybean growers that asked about resistance management. And we saw that when those corn and soybean growers got more information from their university extension agents, when they relied on that source more for pesticide resistance management, they were much more likely to use integrated pest management. That was a significant predictor of them using more integrated techniques. So I think there's a really interesting link there as far as university extension being influential for both growers and crop advisors and maybe being able to make that connection a bit more explicit.
Very good. We had a question in the chat from Seth Dibley from EPA. He said, well, he thanked you for the fascinating presentation, but asked did you venture into any other IPM techniques like cultivar choices, biocontrol, besides the different pesticide options that you talked about?
Yeah, so I basically let crop advisors kind of lead the conversation. And if they wanted to bring those things up, great. Didn't have a lot of people doing that. There was a lot of discussion about other pesticide products and not as much about kind of these other IPM techniques. But every so often people would bring those things up. So while there was definitely a focus, I would say, on kind of the chemical options, I did absolutely have some crop advisors who said, I think we need to diversify. I think we need to look at all these different things. I even had some people saying like, well, we need to have better markets for our cover crops so that people can rotate things better because we need to be able to sell the cover crops to encourage people. So people were looking at some stuff that was out of the box and that was a little more of like this big structural change as well.
Very good. Another question, and I think for us extension folks and that trusting relationship between, kind of any communication, but, between crop advisors and their customers or maybe extension, like how important is that? How do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought it was really interesting that one of the number one things crop advisors said should change in order to, or like one of the most effective options was developing these more trusting relationships with their growers. That popped out to me so much that people agreed with that even more than they agreed with private companies should invest in discovering new modes of action, right? Because even if you discover a new mode of action, people can overuse it, you can kind of lose it after a while. So what they were really focusing on is like that communication and trust and being able to have a dialogue with people. And I think that's just so incredibly important. And one of the things that our research team has looked into is kind of what influences people's trust, right? Like, why do you trust one source of information over another source of information? And interestingly, some of it is, how competent do you think they are? How much of an expert do you think they are? But a lot of it has to do with, does this person have values that are similar to mine? So even if they have like a degree in something, or they say, here's the facts, here's the science, right? That influences whether you trust them. But what are their values? What are they working for? Are they part of an environmentalist group? Are they part of an agrochemical company? And that people assume things about people's values based on those kind of things and say, oh, well, maybe their information is biased because they're coming from this different value orientation. So, what some of our research has suggested is that people need to discuss their values and they need to say, we're all kind of on the same page when it comes to, hey, we understand that we want people to be able to, feed the world and be able to make a living. And where are those common values? We want to be able to sustain this. We want to be able to keep this land in production, keep it in the family. What's that baseline of values that you can kind of agree on and then kind of lead from there? So I think that people kind of underestimate sometimes that kind of human to human connection and that discussion of, what's our purpose? What's our why? What are our values here? And how that can lead to more trusting relationships that ultimately lead to better information exchange.
That's really good. Yeah, I think we kind of, people might assume what our values are based on kind of who we're working with and stuff. So it's very good advice. Any other questions? We had a few questions about if the slide deck will be available. The recording will be made available, and as long as you're registered for this, you will receive that notification when the recording is available, usually within the week that we just provide the recording. And I guess, Katie, you will share what you want to share. People can email you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a similar slide deck to this, I believe, is available on the Weed Science Society of America website. So I did a slightly shorter version for this, but a elongated version of this slide deck is available through the Weed Science Society of America Herbicide Resistance Education Committee website. I'll see if I can find that link for y'all, but it does exist out there somewhere.
Okay, if we can find that link when we share the video out with you, we can share that link as well or post it into the video's comments as well.
It looks like we had a question in the chat of did respondents make any association between agronomic factors such as till, no-till, crop rotation, et cetera, and pesticide resistance? I definitely saw that. In particular, crop rotation was really emphasized. And some of that was like chemical rotation, but some of it was true crop rotation as well. And the idea that if there's more of a market for crop rotation, we could improve things there. Till and no-till is an interesting conversation. And we saw a lot of people bringing that up. And in particular, how losing more effective herbicides might lead to more tillage in places that we don't necessarily want it. But also how tillage can sometimes be used effectively to integrate these kinds of things. So I don't know, there was quite a diversity of opinions. And we saw people kind of all over the map, but we had crop advisors who were definitely more on the side of it's going to be chemicals. It's always going to be chemicals. We also had a lot of crop advisors who were saying, actually, we need to integrate all of these other kinds of things. We need to be looking more into crop rotations. Maybe we've had this issue in the past because we've been too monolithic in our approach. So I think as many of a diversity of opinions as exists out there for growers or for any of us also exist among crop advisors.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming in. I'm just going to the chat. So thank you so much for this. And we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing this and such helpful information to all of us in the IPM community. So we'll make sure to get that video out and share that out with everyone. Thank you all for attending. Just want to let you know that our next Pests in Progress webinar will be March 20th, also 12:30 p.m. Central Time. It'll be on the ecological epidemiology of the invasive Asian longhorn tick, insights from Ohio, and we'll have Andreas Elfteri giving that presentation. So thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.